This is practice A for section 4.7. We're going to list all the pairs of angles and sides that are congruent based on the given congruent statement and the figure. So if they're telling you that these two triangles are congruent, what do you know? You know 6 things, and we've done this before. You know that angle R is congruent to angle X because of the statement. Also, angle S is congruent to angle V. Angle T is congruent to angle Y. That's 3 things. Now the other things you know are the segments. This segment is congruent to that segment because of the statement, not because they look like they go together. Segment RT goes with segment XY, and segment ST goes with segment ZY. Number 2 is the same type of thing. Next section, tell which triangles you can show are congruent in order to prove the statement. What postulate or theorem would you use? Are these congruent triangles? We got congruent angles. We got right angles that are congruent as well. So that's 2 pairs of congruent angles. And we got a pair of congruent sides that are non-included. Are these triangles congruent? Definitely. So I'm going to name this triangle. Triangle TSR. It's congruent to this triangle. Make sure you line up the parts. It would be LMN. They're definitely congruent by angle side. So that's what you say. Now how do you know that this is true? How do you know that this segment is congruent to that segment if the triangles are congruent? Well, if the triangles are congruent, don't you know 6 things? Okay. Well, we only knew 3 things. But if they're congruent, then you know the other 3 things too. So these are congruent parts. Okay, so corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. CPCTC. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So when you say that the triangles are congruent in this section, how do you know their parts are congruent too? It's that reason for all of them. Skip down here to number 8 because that's one that we like to forget about. Are these triangles congruent? Well, there's no pairs of congruent parts marked. I see a pair of sides that are congruent by the reflexive property, and I see some parallel sides and alternate interior angles that forces those alternate interior angles to be congruent. These are parallel as well, so these angles are congruent too. These triangles are congruent by angle side angle. So I'm going to write a congruent statement for the triangles. Triangle, I'll call it ZXW. It's congruent to this triangle over here. Now notice how I did ZXW. I went 1 arc, 2 arcs, no arcs. It's congruent to 1 arc, 2 arcs, no arcs. X, Z, Y. And they're congruent by angle side angle. If you have congruent triangles, how do you know these corresponding parts are congruent too? How do you know this is congruent to that? CP, CT, C. Is there enough information given in the figure to show that the given statement is true? Well, it's the same thing as the last section basically. You got 2 pairs of congruent parts here. You also have congruent angles. So these are congruent triangles by angle side angle. So if the angles are congruent, would the corresponding parts be congruent? They would be by CPCTC. Number 10, let's look at these 2 triangles. You got a pair of congruent sides, and that's about it. They're showing you that this triangle over here is isosceles, which is nice, but it doesn't help you prove that it's congruent to this triangle over here. This triangle over here could be way smaller, or it could be way bigger. You really don't know. Okay? You cannot prove that these triangles are congruent, so you cannot prove that these corresponding parts are congruent. So I'm just going to say only 1 pair of congruent sides. Not enough info. We'll do 12 and 13 in this video also. We're going to use the diagram to write a plan for a proof. I'm not necessarily going to write it. We're just going to kind of talk about it. If you look at these 2 triangles here, look what's given. Pair of congruent sides, pair of congruent sides, pair of congruent sides. 3 pairs of congruent sides are given. So what do you know about these triangles? These triangles are congruent by side, side, side. Well, if they're congruent, doesn't that mean that their corresponding angles or parts are going to be congruent too? By CPCTC. Okay, so you're going to have one step in your proof that states all this given. You're going to have your second step saying that the triangles are congruent by side, side, side. And then your third step is these parts are congruent by CPCTC. Three-step proof. Number 13, they give you some information. Congruent sides here, congruent angles here. That's one step. State these, say that it's given. Second step, you got congruent vertical angles. Don't call them angle R. Use 3 letters to name those angles. Step 3, these triangles are congruent by angle, angle, side. Angle, angle, side. Step 4, the corresponding parts are congruent by CPCTC. There's your plan.